or will the gonads? It was a crazy experiment where if I could dissociate what the sex of the gonad was from what the sex of the brain was and what would happen. But it turned out, I didn't have the good hands that you do, for example. I never learned how to do that experiment. But one resolution of it is, one of the things we now know is going on in birds is that in some cases, it's the brain itself that's making the hormone and is masculinizing itself. So in birds, there's pretty good evidence that brain sexual differentiation happens because the genetic sex of the brain determines how much hormone, including testosterone and estrogen, is getting made locally, and that then is driving sexual differentiation. And that's why you can have, one side of the brain is male and the other side is females. And that just doesn't happen in mammals. That's the mechanism. Once you start using gonadal hormones to direct sexual differentiation, you can end up with that sort of mosaicism, which is maybe too bad. I mean, there are carnival acts where supposedly one side of the body is male and the other side is female, and those have been around for quite a while, but that's a different thing.
I'm going to give you two real-world examples. Real because I was told them, and I believe them. In anticipation of our conversation today, I ventured into some corners of the internet I kind of wish I hadn't. But, in gym culture, bodybuilding culture, there is a subset of people, I don't recommend it, that take synthetic androgens, anabolic steroids of different kinds and in different combinations. And again, I don't recommend people do this, but it's entirely different than hormone replacement therapy or something like that, like experimentation with high dosages of different types of testosterone derivatives. And my interest in understanding a little bit of what some of the general observations are there is a naturally occurring experiment with some thematic averages, which is geek speak for, like, if one person reports something, it means nothing. But if hundreds of people or thousands of people validate that experience, you think, well, it's kind of, these aren't controlled studies, but nonetheless might be interesting. And those communities have long talked about how different forms of androgens have different effects on psychology. And in particular, these days, you can find a lot of discussion in those communities of certain anabolic steroids, trenbolone in particular, that causes aggression, but that is well known for causing otherwise self-reporting as heterosexual males to start wanting to have sex essentially with males or females. This is an effect that seems reversible when they stop. It seems generally associated with a kind of a hypersexuality.
Yeah.
So that's an important variable, right? So there's all sorts of variables there. So that's one observation that that makes me wonder if the adult brain is still plastic at the level of the hypothalamus to androgens later in life. Now, this is not to say that the now millions of men who are taking testosterone replacement, which is very, very common, doing that safely with doctors' support, et cetera, are they're not trying to boost things into supraphysiological range, but it's a naturally occurring experiment with very few controls and only anecdotal reports, but it suggests that the adult hypothalamus is still androgen sensitive in ways that can drive pretty powerful changes in behavior and perception.
And we know that is true because back in the previous century, Julian Davidson at Stanford, actually, in the physiology department there, was among the first to do these double-blind, placebo-controlled studies in men who had lost their testes for one reason or another, accident or cancer, things like that. And so double-blind means neither the man nor the physician who was interacting with him had any idea whether he was getting the placebo or the testosterone. And that's, of course, really important for coming up with conclusions. And they concluded that, in fact, the men who were getting testosterone definitely reported feeling better, feeling more energetic, having a higher libido, and they definitely felt better overall. And Julian said, sort of the joke is that even though men were supposed to be blind to which treatment they were getting, they always knew. They always knew when they were getting the testosterone because they felt so much better. So we know for certain that testosterone does have effects on the adult brain. In many of these cases, right, these were men, prostate cancer cases who were elderly yet, and still, they still responded to that.
Yeah, one thing I learned from your textbook
Oh,
was that, this idea that testosterone diminishes with age is largely true, but the rates are highly variable, and that, there are some individual points on the scatter plot whereby you'll see somebody in their 70s or 80s whose testosterone is very similar to someone in their 20s or 30s. Now, everyone nowadays talks about how testosterone rates are dropping. So these are older studies, but it suggests that there's a tremendous amount of variation. We also know that absolute numbers don't necessarily dictate how people feel. In fact, the CEO of a very, very, very successful company, not a tech company, an entertainment company, came up to me once at a private party and said that his testosterone was down in the low 300s. So this is approaching the lower end of the reference range, but he feels great. And I said, if you're willing, like, what variables are we talking about here? And he explained, vigor, and he explained, libido, and he explained, general enthusiasm for life. And I said, well, I wouldn't change a thing in that case, right? I mean, he's a perfect case whereby low end of normal is not a problem. And who knows, maybe had he taken more, he would have aromatized more to estrogen and he wouldn't have felt as good, for instance.
No, I agree. I mean, if it ain't broke, leave it alone.
Yeah, I think it's something that doesn't get mentioned enough.
But you also point out why humans are such lousy research subjects, because there's so much variability going on. So what I can say is that for the decline in testosterone levels in men, first of all, it's so much more gradual compared to what happens to women at menopause, right? There's no comparison whatsoever. And there is an incredible amount of variation across subjects. And so once again, even though you can say statistically we know this is a trend, I can't make it. You tell me someone's 71 years old, just to pick on me, I can't predict what their testosterone levels are going to be like, or not very well.
Another sociological observation from the internet.
Everything on the internet is true.
Certainly not everything on the internet is true. I know you were being sarcastic, and certainly not everything on the internet is informative, but clusters and averages are interesting to me. There's a meme, which I find interesting, vis-a-vis this type of conversation, whereby I think it was a martial artist, a MMA guy from either Russia or some Eastern country, excuse me. The meme is, it goes something like, send 2-3 years Dagestan and forget. A guy is talking about how he wants his kid to be good at wrestling, and so he's going to send him to Dagestan, where apparently the training is very intense. And the meme goes, send 2-3 years Dagestan and forget. And he said, I'm going to send him there for a few weeks, and then and the guy goes, no, send 2-3 years Dagestan and forget. And that meme, which is it's not a cartoon, it's a guy actually speaking in that context, has been, you can find extensive compilations of people showing kind of effeminate boys dancing, doing kind of theater type activities, and then it transitions to send to their ears Dagestan and forget. The idea being, returning to the beginning of our conversation, that there may be more plasticity early in life, and that masculinization of behaviors, stereotypically defined, okay, I want to be very clear. The idea being that that's very plastic early in life. Okay, I think this is interesting and important to observe, because when I was a kid, my mom, she still tells me this story, but she's told me this, verified this for many years.
Okay.
We had a pediatrician. This was in Northern California. This is just a mile or two away from Stanford School of Medicine. And my pediatrician said to her, you have a boy, Andrew, and there are 3 very important things in raising him. And these were his words. 1, don't let him ride motorcycles.
I agree.
2, don't let him drink soda, too much sugar. Okay, fair. And he said, 3, don't let him do theater. The implication being that boys who do theater have a higher probability of becoming gay.
Yeah.
Now, I was born in 1975,
Yes.
okay? He gave this advice to every parent of a male. And I say that to kind of frame people's understanding of where we were versus where we are. And yet this meme is, I wouldn't say rampant on the internet, but has a fair amount of support for it in the sense that I think there's still the general belief that certain activities can bias sexual orientation. And I just want to zoom out and acknowledge the idea that the brain is plastic to androgens, behaviors impact androgens. So not trying to corral you into a given answer, but I think we've come a certain distance in this, but we haven't really come that far.
Well, and of course, there's no doubt that the younger brain is more plastic. I mean, there's no way around that. But in terms of what one can do, there are limits. And in terms of sexual orientation, I can tell you, people look really hard for any social correlates. You talked earlier about the dad that's missing, or even Freud talked about the overly coddling mother and the dismissive father. That might make a boy more likely to be gay. And so people have looked for those sorts of correlates. The data just aren't there. I mean, it's really, which I think is interesting and kind of strange, because you'd think that if the social influence was that good, that you'd find something. And so in terms of sexual orientation, I think the data are pretty weak. However, in terms of other expressions of male-like behavior, I mean, clearly culture and family has a say, right? I mean, they clearly make an influence. I mean, in terms of what boys are supposed to do, I would say probably the only sex difference that will persist, and that almost certainly is due to biological factors like testosterone, is, you mentioned already, rough and tumble play. Across so many species, you put a bunch of males together and there'll be a lot more physical activity than if you put a bunch of females together. And an interesting thing happens if you put it in a mixed group, and it doesn't matter whether it's monkeys or rats, the overall play will be intermediate. It's like the girls calm the boys down and the boys ramp the girls up a little bit. And so that might be, one that's going to be pretty hard to corral with social influences. But virtually every other expression of masculine behavior, of course, culture and family make a difference. I don't know if, I'm going to suggest anyone send their child to.
Augustin, 2-3 years and
Yes,
forget.
thank you.
The original meme was
saying
the original statement. It was a real statement in a discussion. Was aimed at something else.
Yeah.
It's been co-opted for this.
Of course
This,
it
like
would.
this is the form of intervention or whatever you want to call it. Okay, let's set the internet aside and let's talk about a different upbringing for a moment, which is yours. As a scientist, you have a somewhat unusual trajectory into science. So where were you born?
In the Ozarks, in Springfield, Missouri.
Oh, I was about to say, where are the Ozarks? I know where they are, but to orient our international audience.
Southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. So it's famous because it's hill country, and so very hilly, very much like the Appalachians, both in terrain and in culture, actually. So no, I was born in the Ozarks in a working class family. No one in my family had ever, no one in my mother's generation had finished high school, much less college. And, I was always a little bit different because I was so much more interested in reading than all my cousins say. That all they remember about me when we were growing up is I always had my nose in a book, right? That phrase. And as I get, and I didn't choose that. I didn't choose to like reading, but I always did. And I always loved school. And and I will say I had a great family that was incredibly supportive of me doing whatever I wanted to, right? That would be fine. And as I look back, I realize, and I predict you'll find this too, the older I get, the more I realize how much luck matters and how many very fortunate things happen to me, right? So the first question is, I end up going to Yale College. What? Working class family, working class. So my folks were blue collar workers. I mean, for complicated reasons, I was raised by my grandparents. He was a construction worker, and she worked in a food processing plant.